Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Well, not quite everybody. We're still waiting for some more people to join. It is 1:28 according to my computer clock. We're going to get started and give us 2 or 3 minutes. It seems like June is a popular month for webinars here at CAR Legal, and we had well over 2,000 people sign up. So we want to give people maybe an extra 1 or 2 minutes just to get in. And then I and Justin will get started and we will go through the new and revised forms for June of 2024. Thank you, everybody. Bear with us. All right, while we are waiting for some stragglers to join, just a reminder that if you have a question, you could put it in the Q&A tab. I believe the chat is disabled for attendees, but there will be announcements put on the chat by our wonderful administrative assistant, Brigitte Mayfield. And I see she's doing that on a regular basis, letting everybody know where they can find the handouts. I am going to be joined today by Justin Murakawa. I see that smiling face there. Hi, Justin. How are you?
Doing well. I'm excited to
Doing
present
well.
these forms.
Glad to hear you're doing well. And as somebody already pointed out, I saw, I think, in the Q&A tab, we are pleased to have with us once again in the background, doing their best to answer your questions. I think that Amanda and Jana are not really human. I think they are really AI bots because they get through so many questions. I cannot imagine a human is able to do what they are able to do. But we'll see. Sometimes Amanda comes in afterwards and asks some questions. So I get the sense she is real. She is real. So good. Here we are. We're 1:32. Let's get started. Anybody who comes in late, that's okay. They'll join us a little bit later. Today, we're going to be talking about the CAR new and revised forms that are coming out in exactly 2 weeks. We hope in exactly 2 weeks. On June 25th is the release date for the new and revised forms. So, but before we do that, I thought I would start with a poll. And Brigitte is going to start our poll in just a minute. So here's the question. You're going to have a very short period of time to answer like the question. So what is short, pithy, entertaining, and always right? So A, Neil Kalin's webinars. B, Neil Kalin's hair. C, Neil Kalin's legal advice. I love that graphic for that one. Or D, Robert Bloom's posts on CAR's X or Twitter account. So, Brigitte, have you started the poll? Because I'm not seeing anything, so I'm not sure if it's. Here we go. You started the
Here
poll.
now.
Great. So, give us your answer. I see it there now. Give us your answers. You've got 7 seconds to answer, right? So, what's short, pithy, entertaining, and always right? These webinars, my hair, my legal advice, or Robert Bloom's post on our X or Twitter account? Okay, 5, 4, 3. Wow, a lot of you are answering really quick. I really like that. That's terrific, but we're gonna cut some of you off, even though you're all trying to answer. Okay, give you 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's it. End the poll, Brigitte. Whatever we have, that's gonna be it. So you're gonna say, let's see. We got to about. So are you sharing the results? Is that what you're doing now, Brigitte? I'm
Yes.
guessing you are.
Mhm.
Okay, terrific. All right. So what do we have? So actually about a third of you think these webinars. Wow, that's pretty good. I don't know. Are they always right? Mostly. Uh, almost 25% of you said my hair. You're right about short, and it's getting shorter by the day, but I'm not sure that I would call it entertaining. So let's go on to the next one. My legal advice. Oh, pretty good. About a third of you thought that that's my legal advice. So I really appreciate that. Only 11% of you said Robert Bloom's tweets. Okay, that's it. Let's stop sharing and let's go back to our webinar and get into our, there we go. Maybe that did it. No. Brigitte, can you stop the sharing, or have we stopped the sharing?
Yes, I just stopped it.
You just stopped it. Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. So let's get back. Well, in my view, the answer should have been, when I wrote this question, it should have been Robert Bloom's tweets for CAR on Twitter or on X, whatever you're calling it these days. But then I had Robert send me some of his tweets. And these were 2 of his tweets. I thought, well, no, I guess they're not short, which I kind of thought they'd have to be if they were going to be tweets, but they're definitely pithy, they're definitely entertaining, and they're definitely correct. And really, all things considered, they're pretty short, right? So if you have not signed up yet for CAR's Twitter account, Dex account at CAR Real Legal, right? You know, you can see Robert's tweets. I don't know if he does them every day or every week, but he does a lot of them. And maybe you'll find something that's interesting to you. And if you're a broker, you're a manager, send them out to all of your licensees, to all of your agents, and you can learn something new. Like he gave great information in the 2 that I posted. One relevant to what we're talking about today, because it's dealing with insurance and contingencies, and the other one dealing with how you count using the RPA. So let's get into it. Here is the list, right? Here's this graph. I tried to do a Venn diagram and I couldn't do it. It got too complicated for me. So I did this little graph. We've got new forms. We've got revised forms. CAR releases forms twice a year. We release them in June and in December. This is everything that's been done since December of last year. And so you see, since December of last year, we're really talking about 71 different forms. 22 are related to the NAR settlement, whether they're seller side forms or buyer side forms or forms that apply to both the buyer side and the seller side. We had webinars last week talking about those settlement related forms. Justin and I are not going to talk about those at all today, or at least I don't think we're going to talk about those at all today. We're going to be talking about everything else. And in the everything else category, there's 2 new forms and there's 43 revised forms. Now, the good thing about all of those forms is that a lot of them are just conforming. We're not going to go over every tiny little detail. You can go on to the standard forms page and see a quick summary of everything that was done. But let's talk about the major things today. And of course, the most major form that's being modified for June release is the RPA, the Residential Purchase Agreement. And so here I have for you, excuse me, a list of all of the paragraphs that have some change somewhere in them. And the good news is, of those, what did I say, 43 forms or whatever I just said, 41 forms, whatever I just said, of those forms, when we talk about the RPA, you're really getting 9 forms at once, because when we do the RPA, we want to make sure that all of our other purchase agreements conform with that. So that would include the residential income purchase agreement, the commercial purchase agreement, the vacant land purchase agreement. We even updated our business purchase agreement. We don't need to show all of those separately, but whenever there is a relevant paragraph in all of those related forms, they're going to have the same change as we're going to talk about today. And there we go. Now that we're done with the fun stuff, I get to turn it over to substance to Justin, who's going to talk about the most significant changes to the RPA.
Great. Thanks, Neil. So the RPA has been changed. There are a few what I would call pretty big substantive changes, and then a handful of other ones that sort of clarify practice issues and make the contract a little better. We appreciate the comments that come in, and they help us to tweak and make our forms better all the time. So the first slide, the first change is one of the major substantive changes of the contract. You'll see that under the contingencies paragraph in the grid and under paragraph 8, we've separated out the insurance contingency. Currently, in the current version of the RPA, it's just a subsection of the investigation contingency where you have the ability to look for insurance and the cost of insurance. But since it's becoming such a big issue in California and it's becoming harder and harder to obtain insurance and the cost may be more than a buyer is expecting, the SFAC and many members thought that it would be a good idea to separate it out into its own contingency to make sure that it's highlighted and make sure that the buyer takes the time and approaches it early enough to make sure that they can get insurance for their property. So you'll see it's in the grid in L4, just like the other contingencies. The default is going to be set to 17 days. And it is a contingency to get checked for the availability and the cost and make sure that the buyer approves of those and is comfortable moving forward with the contract. Next slide, please.
Sorry about that. Oh, Justin, before we go to the next slide, just want to say all of these insurance issues, it affects more than the RPA. And so on the bottom of this screen, it shows all the different forms that are going to be impacted by adding this insurance contingency. The notice to buyer to perform, the buyer contingency removal, the buyer homeowner insurance advisory, the homeowner association advisory, the market condition advisory, and the non-contingent offer advisory. They all are impacted by this separate insurance contingency.
Right. And one other thing on the insurance also is that it's its own independent contingency. You don't want to lump it in with the investigation, the loan, or the appraisal. It's its own separate contingency. So if you're canceling based on the insurance, you need to make sure that you still retain that insurance contingency. The next change is not really a big change, but it's one of those good news, bad news things. We've added a number of pages onto the RPA due to some of the changes, but we removed a whole form which got attached to the RPA because there was a requirement to have a Fair Appraisal Act notice. And so what we were able to do is use some of the extra space on the extra page that we added, and we were able to put that Appraisal Act notice on there. And so that is now within the body of the RPA, and there's no need to have the FAAA addendum that just brought in the statutory language that was required. So instead, that is now in paragraph 29, where we referenced the Fair Appraisal Act under the appraisal contingency portion. We have now put a reference to paragraph 29. So it's very similar in concept to what we had before. We just took the separate form and put it within the body of the purchase agreement. Next slide,
and Justin,
please.
real quickly, look what we did. We did something to 7B.
Oh, I apologize. I missed that one. So this was a change to the contract or the formatting of the contract and where it's located. And so one of the questions we get often in the on the hotline is what happens when, you know, the seller moves out? Does the seller repair holes and you know, anything that was hanging up and whatnot? And the only sort of clue we had in the current contract was in paragraph 9B something or other. I think it was actually 9E, where it talked about fixed brackets for audio visual or earthquake securing latches for furniture. And so in that situation, you're supposed to patch the holes but not paint it. But there was always a question as to what happens to all the other holes for wall hangings, mirrors, pictures, and whatnot. And so SFAC thought it would be a good idea to include it here to make it clear that those items, those smaller holes that are for those anything other than brackets are going to be left as is, and so it'll be the buyer's responsibility to take care of any holes after closing. Okay,
All right, let's move
next
on.
slide, please.
Do you see it, Justin?
The next slide that's up here shows a change to the law that's going to add a requirement in certain transactions, and this balcony, external stairway, elevated elements, wooden elevated elements where you have to have an inspection done. That is required on any building with 3 or more dwellings. And so it may not apply to all the transactions that you're doing. It certainly is not going to apply to single family residences, but it will apply if you're doing a residential 3+ now, or potentially if you're in a condo and that there's a building that contains more than 3 dwelling units in it, this will also apply. And so what we've
Justin,
done here
I'm
is
gonna
we've sort of brought in the contract as a reference point.
Justin, I'm going to stop you for a minute. There's a number of people commenting that you are breaking up. So this happened earlier. I thought it was my computer, and it probably was earlier before we started, but it's happening with you. So if you could try shutting off your video and see if that helps. And if not, we're going to have you log off. I'll just pick up where you left off, but let's see if this helps. We still have your video on. There you go.
Okay,
So
so
why don't you
let's
go
see
back
if
to
this works a little bit.
Give it a try.
Okay, let's see if this works a little bit better. And Neil, let me know. And if not, you'll just have to cut me off and take over. But starting back at the beginning of this slide, so there was a change in the law which requires an inspection when there's a residential 3+ building that has balconies, exterior stairways, or other elevated elements that are made of wood. And so the important part is we brought it into the RPA so that there's a reference to it, so that you can know the existence of the law, and it brings in a reference to a new form that we've created, the wooden balcony and stair addendum. And so again, this will be important if you're selling a residential 3+ building, or if you happen to be selling a condo that is within a building that has 3 or more condo units in it. And so basically it requires an inspection to be done every 6 years, I believe, if you have a 3+, and every 9 years if you have a condo situation with that three dwelling units in the building. And it requires the disclosure to be made to purchasers in such buildings. And so the RPA itself is just bringing the reference in, and then we have this additional form, the wooden balconies and staircase addendum, which goes through all the requirements needed to fulfill that law. Next slide, please.
Okay, but before you go to the next slide, just a reminder, this law is effective starting January 1st of next year. But because one would have to start getting these inspections and it may be difficult, that's why we are inserting language into the RPA now, rather than waiting until our December release, where it may be very close to those sales that are effective starting January of next year. So just a little reminder about that. We're trying to give everybody a heads up. It is perfectly permissible to have these inspections prior to January 1st. And those who have 3 or more units with elevated balconies, stairs, etc., may want to start thinking about that. I saw a question in the Q&A. Does it apply to a single family residence? No, it's only buildings containing 3 or more units. Now we'll move on to the next slide.
It's not
Ready for
switching
you.
for me.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. So these changes on these 2 paragraphs, I think, are definitely something to pay attention to, but I think they're helping to clarify situations that weren't quite as clear to certain members and certain buyers and sellers. So first off, in the notice to buyer or seller to perform paragraph, there are two tweaks to that paragraph. The first one is talking about the 2 days to serve the notice to buyer to perform. And we wanted to make it clear that that is not the same process as for the close of escrow. And so you'll see in that first red line that this 2-day requirement is required for all the obligations within the contract, except for close of escrow, which will be handled under 14G. 14G is not on the screen, but just for reference, it's the whole demand to close escrow process, and it lays out that that's a 3-day requirement. The second red line within the notice to buyer to perform section is something that we believe is already happening in practice and is in our notice to buyer to perform form, but it deals with what happens if you send a notice to buyer to perform for like 3 contingencies to be removed, but for whatever reason, the loan contingency or one contingency is longer than the others and isn't due yet. So the question coming up on the hotline is that whole notice invalid? Is it valid for the ones where the timing was all right? You know, what is the status? And so the RPA is going to make it clear here that when a notice of buyer to perform is served, it is valid for the ones that under which the procedure was handled correctly and invalid for all the other ones. So in my example where, like, for instance, the loan contingency was 25 days and everything else was 17, and you got a notice of buyer to perform on day 17, it would be valid for every contingency except the loan. The change paragraph 19 is something that we think is going to be helpful for staying in compliance and staying transparent with your clients in terms of compensation earned. And that's one of the big topics right now, especially with the NAR settlement and all the changes there and all the things that'll have to be done, is making it clear exactly what is earned within the contract, or sorry, within the transaction. And so we wanted to add an extra protection, an extra way for the client, the principal, to be informed. So within this contract, we have an escrow instruction that escrow is going to provide the buyer and seller a closing statement or other written documentation showing the amount of compensation paid to each of the brokers. So this will satisfy.
Okay, sounds like we lost Justin again. So Justin, I'm going to pick up from here, and I'm going to ask maybe if you'll log off and try to log back in, and you'll just join in wherever I am when you come back in, because we've lost you again. Sorry about that, Justin. Sorry about that, everybody. So Justin was talking about paragraph 19D and in the RPA, and just a reminder, we added this language. So here is my one little reference that's going back to the settlement related forms where we had 2 webinars last week. We want to make sure that both buyer and sellers understand how much they are paying their respective broker. And so escrow is given an instruction to provide to the parties a statement of what the compensation is. And that could be a joint statement, or it could be a separate statement. That's really going to be an escrow holder determination as to how to provide that statement for the principals in the transaction. So let's go on a little bit further into the RPA and look at some other changes. Well, we had a question dealing with delivery and timing of delivery and when something is actually delivered. And the statement in paragraph 25K defines delivery as when a document is in possession of the other party or an authorized agent. Now, we know from previous versions of the RPA that as long as there was a designated electronic delivery address that was authorized, as soon as the sending party hits send on their computer, that is deemed to be delivery. But what if you were in a transaction and electronic delivery was not specifically authorized? Could you still deliver electronically? Yes. When would that delivery be effective? It would be effective when that document, whatever it was, that was sent electronically was in possession of the other party. Well, what does it mean to be in possession when a document is sent electronically? And so we added a definition here. And again, this is only going to be applicable if there is not designated electronic delivery. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. So look at that blue language on your screen. Document shall be deemed to be in possession if it is located in the inbox for the applicable party or authorized agent. So what we're saying is, if the party who is receiving something makes the decision not to open up their email, not to open up a document that is in their email, not to look at their inbox, that's on them. As long as that can somehow be established that the document has been placed into the receiving party's inbox, it is deemed to be in possession for the recipient party. This added definition may not make that much of a difference, though, going forward, starting on June 25th. Why is that? Well, because we already provided in the purchase agreement that there could be delivery when sent if there was an acknowledged designated electronic delivery address. So what we have here is, it says, or an electronic copy or link to the document has been sent to the designated electronic delivery address specified, unless otherwise agreed. So the default position is going to be, starting with the June release of the RPA, the default position is going to be that electronic delivery is an acceptable way to send a document, okay? So previously you had to sort of opt in. Now that's going to be the default. And if somebody does not want to accept delivery electronically, then they're going to have to opt out using the separate form designated electronic delivery addendum. So we sort of reversed the process going forward. That additional blue language will be helpful in the event somebody does opt out, but it may not be as relevant going forward. Moving on in the RPA, we're going to the offer and acceptance paragraph, and there is some language that was added. What really needs to be looked at is, we're just looking at the offer, so the buyer side, but the same language happens in the seller side with the acceptance. And let's look at that paragraph B5, the full name of the entity, right? So we already had a way to identify the full name if there was a trust or if there was a probate proceeding, because those often have very long names. There's no way to put those full names into the signature blocks in the RPA. But we did not have that same equivalent ability to put a full long name for an entity, a corporation or an LLC or a limited liability partnership, for example. So moving forward, there's going to be a way to do that, so that if you have a sort of short version, you could use that as the name of the principal, as long as you have the full name of the entity specified in paragraph B5, whether it's going to be on the buyer side or the seller side. And that takes us to the real estate broker section, sort of what I was just talking about. In a little bit, we'll get down to paragraph 5, but before we get down to paragraph 5, let's take a quick look at paragraph 3, confirmation of offered compensation. Well, we know moving forward that the MLS will no longer be used as a vehicle for the listing broker to offer compensation to the buyer's broker. So what will be the methodology, the best methodology, to confirm whatever agreement has been reached between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker in a residential transaction, really for any transaction using CAR forms? Well, you always want to document that agreement between the brokers if the listing broker has been authorized to cooperate with the buyer's broker. Okay, under the law, verbal agreements between licensees are enforceable, but that may be fine and good. How do you determine what the actual nature of that agreement is? You always want to have something in writing. The best way to do that, we think, is to use the revised CAR form, Cooperating Broker Compensation Agreement, Form CBC. So there's the reference there in the broker section to paragraph 3. Then we get down to the signatures, buyer broker signatures and seller broker signatures. And what do we see there for designated electronic delivery address? notice the default is right there. Whatever email is put into paragraph A, that's going to be the default method for providing electronic delivery of documents during the course of the transaction. Can you write something else in? Sure, there's a whole blank line. You could do that, right? Maybe you are in a situation where the principal or the authorized agent does not want to have delivery be effective when sent. Well, then you're going to need to opt out. You're going to have to attach Form DEDA, right? And you could use that form either to do one of two things, either to indicate an alternate method of delivery or to opt out of designated electronic delivery. So let's take a look at that next slide. And here is the revised designated electronic delivery address amendment, DEDA. It's an amendment. Earlier I believe I said addendum. It is an amendment. So what do you have? Pretty simple. You identify the buyer's agent's designated delivery address or the seller's agent designated delivery address. We reiterate in paragraph 3 that the effective date of electronic delivery is when sent. And it says, unless paragraph 4 is checked. So you have to opt out of electronic delivery as opposed to what we have in the current version of the RPA. If you want to opt out, you need to use a separate form. You need to have paragraph 4 checked. Trying to change my slide. There we go. So Justin had already talked about, and see, Justin's having trouble getting back in. So a good thing there's 2 of us on here today, which is fine. That's the way it goes sometimes in the electronic world. So what are we looking at right now on the screen? We're looking at the revised seller property questionnaire, Form SPQ. That's what we're looking at now. Notice we have a change in addition to paragraph 6, 6K in the SPQ. What does 6K talk about? Well, we're asking the seller, are you aware of whether there's been any inspection reports on those exterior balconies, stairways, other elevated elements, anything like that, right? With if you have a building with 3 or more units on it. And I saw there was a lot of questions. So here we're going to be asking the seller, are you aware of whether there has been an inspection and a report prepared, right? And it could have been as long as it's been within the last 6 years, you're okay. If you are in a condo association, then the report would have had to have been prepared within the last 9 years. So we want to know if the seller knows that there's been such a report. Then on the SPQ, we move down to paragraph 7. And what do we look at in paragraph 7? Well, in 7E, we wanted to draw some additional information on pre-1978 properties, right? Because if there is pre-1978 properties, you know that there's going to have to be a lead-based paint disclosure and booklet that's going to be provided. But what if there was work done, right? So we're in the repair and alteration section of the SPQ. So we wanted to be more explicit. Well, ask, have there been any renovations on this pre-1978 property? That's E1. And if the answer is yes, then we want to ask the seller, are you aware whether the renovations were done in compliance with the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA's lead paint renovation rule? So my guess is most sellers may not be aware, even if they had work done, but it's good to know under E1 if they had done any kind of renovations. What about paragraph 7F, right? This is the so-called flipper rule that someone who buys property and resells it within 18 months after accepting, if they purchased within 18 months prior to selling it, prior to accepting an offer to selling it, We're not talking about the closing date. We're talking about accepting an offer. So if they bought within the previous 18 months and they made improvements, okay, then there's a number of disclosure requirements. And a lot of people think of this rule, they're only concerned about developers. And why? Because the disclosure requirements, you need to not just say that there were improvements, but identify those improvements, to list them out, to identify the name of the contractor, to identify if there's been permits issued. If there have not been permits issued, to give contact information so that the buyer may be able to get those permits from a contractor. Again, I think a lot of people think this rule only applies to persons who purchased a property with the intention of rehabbing, remodeling, developing it in some sort of way, and then reselling it. But it is not limited in that regard. It could apply to anybody. So you could represent a buyer. A buyer comes in, the buyer says, you know what, I'm going to fix up the bathrooms to make them more to my liking. And lo and behold, 12 months later, that buyer is transferred out of state. So that buyer is now selling the property. If they get a buyer, then guess what? They had done improvements possibly within the 18 months prior to entering into a contract to sell. So they need to comply with this disclosure requirement as well. Okay. Again, primarily, you're probably concerned about the developer purchaser, but it could apply in another situation as well. Additional items that have been added to the SPQ, paragraph 8, we look at 8B. Is there a solar power system? Well, guess what? We want then the parties to bring in the CAR form, SOLAR. It's a solar disclosure. We did not mention that form specifically before, but now we are. There's wonderful questions that trigger a seller's memory about the solar power system that may be on the property. And then look at paragraph 8E. Is there a dwelling unit on the property other than the main one? And initially we were trying to figure out exactly how to word this. I like the way it will be broken up starting in June of this year. Well, if there is another structure, first we want to know, are there separate utilities and meters for that unit, for that dwelling? And second, you want to know in paragraph 82, whether that dwelling has received a permit or government approval so that it is itself a proper accessory dwelling unit. Because a lot of people use those words, even though the property was not properly permitted for an ADU. So we want that question to be specifically asked. Going along the lines of the so-called flipper disclosure, remember that information, those questions are in the seller property questionnaire. But we've heard through the grapevine, so to speak, that there are an occasional seller who may be a developer purchaser who says, I do not want to use the seller property questionnaire. I am only going to use the statutorily mandated real estate transfer disclosure statement. Now, a seller may decide to do that, and I hope that they have an attorney drafted addendum to the contract to opt them out of the contractual requirement to use a seller property questionnaire if there is not a TDS exemption. But we wanted to throw a reminder into the TDS in case somebody was taking that position, that if you are in these situations, right, you purchased the property within 18 months of entering into a contract to sell it, and you made improvements, you are going to need to use the SPQ to make the new statutory disclosure. Is there anything else on the seller property questionnaire that is, worthy of attention? Yes, paragraph 18 dealing with properties, we want to know whether the property is tenant occupied currently. Of course, a buyer would be interested in knowing that. And then even if the property is not currently tenant occupied, if there was a previous tenant of the property, we want to know how was it that that tenant wound up leaving the property? Were they evicted? Did the owner give them cash to get them out? Did they voluntarily move out? Why is that important if the tenant is no longer in the property? The reason that is important is because many jurisdictions in California that have rent and eviction controls have rights that are granted to the prior tenant if their vacancy did not happen properly under state or local law. So that's why a buyer needs to know, was there a prior tenant? How is that prior tenant removed, or did they go voluntarily, so that the purchaser can look into whether they are buying a property that has a potential risk problem with the former tenant that is no longer there. All right, we're talking about now one of my favorite forms, because it's one of my favorite form names, and it's the withdrawal of offer, car form WOO, and we've made some additions to it. And really, we wanted to make this form more globally applicable, right? So you may think of the WOO form, the WOO form, withdrawal of offer, that maybe there is an offer outstanding and now a seller has received other offers on the property, right? And so maybe the seller has a counteroffer out there, and the seller does not want that first buyer to accept the counteroffer until the seller has had a chance to evaluate other offers that have been received. Well, what can the seller do about that? Seller has a counteroffer. If it is a regular counteroffer, as soon as that counteroffer has been returned back, signed by the buyer, then the seller is in a binding contract. So what a seller could do in a situation like that, the seller can withdraw the counteroffer form. A withdrawal legally can be made verbally, but it's always better to do the withdrawal in writing. And that's what form WOO is for. But there's other items besides a counteroffer in which somebody may want to withdraw it. A buyer may want to withdraw a purchase offer before it is accepted. A buyer may want to withdraw a buyer counteroffer before it is accepted by the seller, right? There may be a situation where a multiple counteroffer is out and the party does not want it to remain open, right? This could also apply to a request for repairs, where somebody's saying, yes, I will do these things, and you're waiting for a response back, but now circumstances have changed before the responses come back. So we wanted to make the withdrawal of offer applicable to more situations. And that's what is done here. You identify in paragraph 1A what type of document is being withdrawn. Okay, notice 1C says, whoever had made that offer, it hereby withdraws and revokes it. If there happened to be a prior verbal withdrawal or withdrawal using some other mechanism, maybe one of the parties sends a text saying, I withdraw my counteroffer, right? So you're doing something in writing, but does it have a signature? Is it an effective withdrawal? It's always best to follow up with the WOO form. And then if there is a withdrawal, maybe there's going to be a substitution of that document. So a good example would be a seller has a counteroffer out to a buyer. Now the seller has received additional offers. So the seller wants to turn that counteroffer into a multiple counteroffer. Why? Because whereas a counteroffer is accepted once the buyer signs it and returns it back to the seller or the seller's authorized agent, in a multiple counteroffer, the buyer would still have to return it back to the seller or the seller's authorized agent, but there would have to be a subsequent signature of the seller, right? So maybe the seller wants to withdraw an item and replace it with something else. So before we move on, I just want to let you know, give you a little bit of background, excuse me, about the CAR, some of the CR Standard Forms Committee thinking. They were thinking of creating separate buyer and seller withdrawal forms. And then we said, we're not sure how this looks because we are going to have a withdrawal of offer per seller and a withdrawal of offer per buyer. But then the form would have been whoops or whoopee. And we're not sure that that would have come out quite as good. So we'll just stick with the woo, and I'll move on with my bad dad joke and go on to the next form, the tenant occupied property addendum. We have an addition here. Remember, the default in the contract is the property is going to be sold subject to tenant's rights. You could use the tenant occupied property addendum, check paragraph 1B and say a property is going to be delivered vacant. We recognized years ago that because of the difficulty of removing tenants in California, we had to give the seller the option of doing something if the seller was not in good faith able to remove the tenant. And that's what paragraph 1B2 is all about. The seller can notify the buyer, I cannot in good faith get the tenant out in time. Buyer, you now have a choice. You can either cancel the agreement or you can go forward accepting the tenant in place. Well, if we look at paragraph 1B2 and we look at the cancellation option, it says, buyer, you could cancel this agreement and your sole remedy is return of your deposit and your reasonable out-of-pocket expenses. Maybe a seller wants to put a cap on those reasonable out-of-pocket expenses. And so we've added the ability of the seller to do that. We're on to the cancellation of contract. So we have, you see a change in paragraph 2C. This is 2C1. This is in the case of the full release. 2C1, you check the box. Seller authorizes release of the buyer's deposit back to the buyer. When would that happen? Well, probably the most common circumstance would be if the buyer did not remove a contingency, the seller canceled rightfully after giving a notice to buyer to perform. Under the RPA, the seller is obligated in that situation to return the buyer's deposit. So this is a way of documenting that situation. Maybe you have a situation where the seller is somehow at fault in the transaction and the buyer is willing to let the transaction cancel as long as the seller returns the buyer's deposit. But notice the buyer may say, in such a situation, seller, I want to be reimbursed for my out-of-pocket expenses since you were the one that really caused this transaction to fail. We did not have a way to address that in the previous version of the cancellation of contract. We will have a way to address that going forward in 2C1 of Form CC. All right, what about the agent visual inspection disclosure form AVID? We kind of move things around a little bit. So the biggest difference here is in the paragraph where the agent performing the inspection signs the AVID. And notice, so here in this spot, as opposed to being up on the first page, but here in this spot, we identify the inspection date and time, the weather conditions, and whether anybody else is there watching the AVID as it occurred, okay? And really just a reminder at the bottom for the other broker, the one who was not conducting the investigation, not using the AVID form, but the other broker in the transaction, yeah, it would be nice if they sign the AVID, but is their signature legally necessary? No, it's not legally necessary, but it's kind of nice to have as evidence that they did receive the form. Verification of property condition, form VP. What's the change here? Well, the change here is that who can the verification of property be done by? By the buyer or by somebody else, right? The buyer might have an inspector come in and help them with the final verification. And then we want to know at this time, what is the date and time of that final verification? And then we've got some of our property management forms. Remember that chart I showed at the beginning, and we had all these forms, and we had 40 some new and revised forms, and then we had other property management forms. We're going to address those right now. So the big change is from a law that's effective July 1st of this year, and it changes the maximum security deposit that a housing provider can charge a tenant. Current rule is for unfurnished property, the housing provider can charge a tenant up to the equivalent of 2 months' rent. For furnished property, the housing provider can provide a tenant or can charge a tenant the equivalent of 3 months' rent for a fully furnished unit. Going forward, those rules do not apply anymore. The new rule effective July 1st is going to be the general rule, the maximum security deposit that a housing provider can charge a tenant is the equivalent of 1 month's rent. However, if the housing provider is deemed to be what we're calling a small landlord, someone who does not own a lot of properties, then the housing provider can charge up to 2 months' rent, with one exception to that. Okay? So no longer will there be an ability to charge the equivalent of 3 months' rent, even if the unit is fully furnished. Okay? So in our residential lease and month-to-month rental agreement, we put that language directly in the security deposit paragraph. We move some other language from a graph directly into the security deposit paragraph just to make sure everybody knows what's going on and they don't have to look around. All right, so I mentioned there's the possibility that a housing provider can charge up to 2 months' rent. How so? Well, that's if they're considered a small landlord. How would you know? You would bring into the transaction, into the lease transaction, the new CAR form, security deposit exemption, disclosure, and addendum. This form basically just talks about there is this law, here is an exception. When would the exception apply? Well, the landlord, we use the phrase housing provider. The statute uses the term landlord, as a natural person, or if a LLC, all members of the LLC are natural persons. Okay? And here's the real trigger point. The landlord owns no more than 2 residential rental properties that collectively include no more than 4 dwelling units offered for rent. Okay, so let me just give a couple of quick examples. Let's say I am the landlord. I own a house that I live in. I own a single family house that I rent out. And I own a triplex, so 3 units that I also rent out, right? So all told, I own 3 different properties, okay? But only 2 of those properties are rental properties. So far, it looks like I am meeting the exception under paragraph 2. But then we have to say, wait, collectively, there can be no more than 4 dwelling units. So in my no more than 4 rental units, right? So I have 3 units in one property and 1 single family residence. So in my example, I would fall within the exception. I would have the potential ability to charge the tenant up to 2 months' rent as security deposit. If I owned either more rental properties or those properties had more units in them, I would not fall within the exemption. I would be limited to 1 month's rent for security deposit. So let's say we have the situation. I am filling this out. I'm letting a tenant know I fall within the exemption. So it is legitimate for me to try to charge up to 2 months equivalent rent for security deposit, the tenant can then come back to me and say, well, wait a minute, I am an active member of the armed services. The maximum I can be charged is 1 month rent as security deposit. It does not matter that you, the landlord, that you, the housing provider, are exempt. There is a cap on the amount of security deposit that can be charged a member of the armed services. Then it would be up to the tenant to complete paragraph 5 and return it back to the housing provider. We made a change to our property management agreement. The default in the property management agreement is that the rental property owner is exempt. So the rental property owner would have the ability to charge up to 2 months rent, but that may not be the case. A lot of people who hire property managers have multiple properties. If they exceed 2 rental properties or 4 dwelling units combined, then they would not be exempt. And as part of the property management agreement, paragraph I to B would need to be checked. Those of you who are involved in property management, it is incumbent upon you to have that discussion with a client when getting the property management agreement signed. There was a change to the short-term rental agreement. So these are rentals for 30 days or less. There was a California law that says a occupant basically is given an unrestricted right to cancel within 24 hours. We had some language in our short-term rental agreement that we thought worked to cover that situation, but our members said it is not as explicit as the way the law is written, so we modified our language to be more explicit. We have a seasonal addendum, so if you have longer term rentals, so more than 30 days, but not exceeding 90 days, it's the CAR position that the housing provider, that the rental provider in that multi-month short-term rental probably needs to comply with the regular landlord-tenant laws. That means there would be a cap on the amount of security deposit consistent with what we talked about before. We got a couple minutes left. Here's our reminders of what's going on at the legal department. So in July, we've got a great webinar being presented by Jana and Olivia, and they're going to talk about dealing with abusive clients and agent. So really a different kind of attack. I know last year when Olivia did a presentation, we got so many comments about it, favorable comments about it. So we're pleased to have that one. And on August 13th, we're having what I call our almost annual escrow industry webinar. And we've asked the escrow industry representatives if they would talk about compensation in the new era and how escrows are going to be addressing compensation on the buyer side and compensation on the seller side in this new post-NAR settlement era. And they may be addressing other issues as well. They probably will. Every month we have a quick guide. Last month's quick guide had to do with watching what you write and what you say. The Legal Matters podcast. So Jana does a Legal Matters podcast. She does it with CAR attorney Dana. So Jana and Dana do this podcast. The current podcast, episode 21, addresses some of these things that we are talking about. They address these mid-year new laws. So the law about the flipper disclosure, the so-called flipper disclosure, and the security deposit new rules. And they're going to go more in depth into those and maybe some other mid-year requirements than I, of course, have the time to get into today. A reminder, we've got, the Instagram account. Dana, who you'll hear on the podcast, does our Instagram account. And Robert, they're not always short, but they're definitely pithy. They're definitely entertaining. They're definitely correct. So, you may be interested in looking at the @CAR Real Legal social media account. And before I go, you know what? I saw a couple of things in my email inbox this morning. Just wanted to remind everybody, if you happen to be in Southern California, you're going to be around Dana Point tomorrow and Thursday. Why not go to Women Up? Women Up's annual conference. It's the next 2 days. It's in Dana Point. It really is a great program. There is a fee for that. Do I know what the fee is? No, but if you go to www.iamwomanup.com, you can find out, and hopefully you can still register, this day in advance. And I saw this other notice that I thought was really great. And I don't know if you know this, but a lot of people, they're kind of confused about how to use ZipForm. Well, here at CAR, we've got 2 members of the staff. I'm assuming it's probably these 2, or at least it's one of these 2. It's Jackson and Ed. And they have what they call ZipForm office hours with the Zip guys. So what a great deal. And that is when? It's a week from today at 10 in the morning. So you can, I guess, log in, go to the Zoom, log in, and ask them all of your Zip questions, and they will give you answers to all of your Zip questions. How cool is that? I think it is. So if this screen was not here long enough for you to copy the URL, well, you'll get a copy of this, or you can pick it up tomorrow when it gets posted on car.org, risk management live. And that's it. So 2:29, I've got time for one 30-second question. Amanda, is there anything you want me to try to answer? Oh, maybe Amanda's gone. I don't see her on there anymore. So that's it. I see Brigitte is giving us some claps. I appreciate, oh my goodness, I see all the questions you were asking for. You were asking Amanda and Jana. And once again, they did a superhuman performance. Thank you very much, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the webinar. Again, it is being recorded. It will be posted and on car.org/risk management/live. And it will be there no later than tomorrow afternoon. Good luck, everybody, with the new forms release. Good luck, everybody, with the listing agreement, with the buyer representation agreement, and with your practice in this new era that we all have to be ready for. Thank you, everybody. Bye now.